Nearly 4 years ago, in July of 2020, YouTuber MatPat, the guy behind like game theory and film theory, launched his newest channel, Food Theory. And I remember when this was new, a lot of people were confused. You know, like games to movies to food. Yeah, people kind of thought it was a joke. But then they actually watched the videos and were like, oh, okay, no, I get it. And what was the first thing people heard when they watched that very first ever Food Theory? Well, technically the first thing they heard was MatPat singing a cover of Friday by Rebecca Black. But after that, they heard the Food Theorist theme song. Hi! I did that. Yes, again, my name is Ryder, also known as FootofaFerret on the internet, and I wrote the Food Theorists theme song, and I want to talk about it. You know, some of you may have seen the video I made, like, maybe a week ago, where I talked about this, like, orchestral arrangement of the game theory theme that I did for Matt's final video before he retired from hosting his channels. And that video got a way more positive reception than I was expecting, so I figured, why not make some more videos about my other theorist music? Sorry that this keeps shaking. The desk is wobbly. But first, food! Do you eat it? Would you like it to be better? Would you like it to be easier? Well, let me introduce you to Cook Unity, the sponsor of today's video. Cook Unity is the first meal delivery service to ever bring the work of innovative and award-winning chefs right to your doorstep. They have a super flexible weekly subscription plan that lets you pick anywhere between 4 and 16 meals that they'll ship right to you. Choose from hundreds of meals and pick your favorites with, you know, plenty of options for dietary preferences, vegan stuff, gluten-free stuff, paleo. It is super convenient, with every meal being pre-prepared and fully cooked, so no mess, no big cleanup, just pop it into the oven or microwave if you want, and you're golden. Personally, I decided to try the chicken parmigiana with rigatoni and fresh tomato sauce by Chef Pat LaFrida, the garlic butter chicken with broccoli by Chef Tony Perez, and the lamb burger by Chef Akhtar Nawab. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. The first two are kind of pure comfort meals for me. You can't really go wrong with chicken in any context. And while I am a burger fanatic, just ask anyone who knows me, I've never tried a lamb burger before, so this is a bit out of my comfort zone. But I gotta say, not only were these meals super convenient to make, quick, easy, no mess, but they all just tasted so good. Plus, as a diabetic, having the number of carbs in the dish printed right on the front of the package is such a plus. Makes everything really convenient when trying to prep my insulin dosage before eating. Really love that. So if you want to try out Cook Unity for yourself, you're in luck, because today you can get your first order for half off by going to cookunity.com/ferret50 or by clicking the very top link in the description down below and using my coupon code FERRET50. That is FERRET50. Like I said, the subscription is totally flexible, allowing you to pause, skip, or cancel anytime you want, so you got nothing to lose. Again, that is cookunity.com/FERRET50, or just click the top link in the description and use coupon code FERRET50 to get your first order for 50% off. Major thanks to Cook Unity for sponsoring, and now, back to the music. So to start, let's just give the full Food Theory track a listen. Genuinely, separated from the fact that I made it, this song is a jam. It's genuinely one of my favorite things I've ever written. But this exact track wasn't always the plan. When Matt and I started thinking of ideas for like a food theory theme song and what that would be, we started looking for inspiration in kind of the most obvious place to start: food shows, like Food Network stuff. And the first thing that kind of came to my head were those like Guy Fieri type food shows where they just kind of drive around the country and show off like the most extravagant, extra junk food they can. And a lot of those shows kind of lean on like blues and blues rock music to set their tone. You know, big overdriven guitar riffs and heavy drums and this just kind of swagger that says, I don't know, Grease. So I actually did 2 different passes on blues tracks for the Food Theory theme. I'm gonna play them for you, but keep in mind, these did not make it past the early demo stages, and I did not know anywhere near as much about music production then as I do now, so if they sound kind of rough, that's why. So first up, we have the big kind of Guy Fieri blues rock track. You know, big heavy drums, fuzzy guitars, some like blaring rock organs, classic stuff. But then there was another blues one that wasn't quite as intense. Much more old school, kind of like 50s, early rock and roll era. Hold on, let me go get the guitar that I used. I'll be right back. I just kind of took this guitar. This is a Gibson SG. Gibson is the brand that makes it, and SG is the model of guitar it is specifically. It stands for solid guitar. I plugged this into an old amp from the 70s that I used to have, just cranked it all the way up, and it gave me this gnarly old school guitar tone. You know, a lot of us actually did like this track, but we kind of just decided it didn't properly fit the vibe. You know, MatPat is not Guy Fieri, as much as we could dream. And the heavier blues one, we just kind of decided was the loser of the batch. It was fine, but it didn't really work. But then we thought of kind of the most obvious source of inspiration for a show like Food Theory, Good Eats. If you've never heard of it, Good Eats is a Food Network show from the late 90s and early 2000s hosted by a guy named Alton Brown. And it's kind of like if Bill Nye the Science Guy had a food show. So obviously perfect for a guy like MatPat and a show like Food Theory. So we all kind of gave a listen to the Good Eats theme just to kind of get a feel for what it was doing. And the vibe that I picked up on was this kind of quirky, kind of surfy, new wave vibe. Is that actually the most accurate read on what that theme show sounds like? Not really, but while we were talking about it, I just kind of threw out that it reminded me of Oingo Boingo, and Matt just went, yes. More explanations. Oingo Boingo was an 80s new wave group led by Danny Elfman, you know, the guy who would later go on to compose the music for all of Tim Burton's movies, The Simpsons theme, all that kind of stuff. Also, these days, he's selling a life-size glow-in-the-dark replica of his hand. He calls it the elf hand. I don't know, dude's weird. But Matt and I are both huge fans of Oingo Boingo, so we decided to try going in that direction, and not surprisingly, that is what you hear on the final track. So now, finally, let's break it down a bit. So just like with the Game Theory Symphony, the first thing I did here was try and figure out what instrumental palette I wanted to use. Again, kind of trying to form the virtual band in my head who was going to be performing this music. But luckily, it was actually really easy to do this time because I could just look up old footage of Oingo Boingo and clock what instruments they were using. Specifically, I found this old live video of them from 1987 and saw that they were using, unsurprisingly, 2 guitars, drums, and bass, like any rock band, plus synthesizers, bass synthesizers, and horns. And that's kind of standard for a lot of 80s pop rock bands, but then they wheeled out these 2 giant marimba-like instruments. You've probably heard something kind of similar to a marimba before if you've played Crash Bandicoot or Banjo-Kazooie. They use those instruments all the time. And when I saw Danny Elfman whacking that marimba like a madman, the idea solidified. So the very first thing you hear in this song is this super fast riff that's kind of a little jazzy. You know, the other Theorist theme songs all kind of have these quick intros that get you into the song, especially Film Theory with that thing. And obviously, with a song this short, you can't just throw the listener into the deep end. You can't just start at 100, you kind of have to rev into it. And with the image of Danny Elfman playing a marimba solo in my head, I wrote this riff. And it's made up of 3 different instruments playing all at the same time. Of course, there's the marimba. But doubling that, the more prominent thing you hear is an organ, which kind of adds this fun 70s prog rock sound to the track. And then kind of filling out the low end here, the last instrument we have is a bass. However, for this particular section, this is not a real bass guitar. This is a replication of a bass guitar using something called MIDI. I think I forgot to clarify this in my last video, but MIDI is a digital music term that stands for Musical Instrument Digital Interface. I had to read that. Basically, it's the digital electronic junk that allows this keyboard to connect to this computer and make sounds happen. But it's also kind of become this catch-all term for all the different instrument replication sounds that are in music programs like the one I use. So if I open up my music program and I click their preset that says bass, it's a MIDI bass. You got that? Cool. None of it matters. I don't normally like using MIDI guitar sounds because as a guitarist myself, I think they sound, terrible. Have you ever heard a MIDI electric guitar sound? Really heard one? It's the musical equivalent of I don't know, going to the dentist. Ugh. A MIDI bass isn't as bad, but I still don't like to use it if I don't have to. But this particular riff I wrote on the keyboard, and it was a little bit too complicated for me to easily translate it to the bass, so I just did a copy and paste job. I also recorded it at a much slower tempo and then sped it up later because I am also a terrible keyboard player. I'm just bad at all this, apparently. But after that intro riff, we kind of blast into the main part of the song. And here, I kind of wanted things to feel like a jam session. You have fun, upbeat groove with a bunch of disparate parts that kind of all form this controlled chaos, which of course is all built on the foundation of some classic rock drums. A sort of gliding bass line that this time is actually played on a real bass guitar. Contrasting that, we have a synth bass line that's doing like some classic 80s octave jumping. If you're not familiar, octaves are two notes that are basically identical, but one is higher than the other. So this note, the octave will be this. Same note. So you can hear this like old 80s synth bass sound jumping between the octaves here. And all of that accompanies this fast-paced, funky guitar riff. This was actually the very first thing I wrote for this song. I grabbed this exact guitar, and I'm like, okay, we just need something that's kind of like old school 80s white boy funk. And I came up with this riff in like a few minutes. And honestly, I wasn't like super impressed with the riff when I first wrote it, but as soon as I started laying everything around it, it started really clicking, especially when the marimbas come back into play. You know, there's a few different marimba parts playing throughout the verse here. You have this like fun, bouncy Crash Bandicoot thing going on in the rhythm. You get kind of a different vibe in the mix with this like old synth marimba sound that's doing a cool arpeggiator thing. I mentioned in my last video that an arpeggio is basically when you take one chord and split the notes up into individual, well, notes. You play them individually. Well, some synthesizers have arpeggiator settings that all you have to do is just like hold a chord, any chord, and the machine will like sequence out the notes for you, and you can get these like really cool fast synth riffs without really having to do anything. A really good example that you've probably heard is the Stranger Things theme. That intro riff to the Stranger Things theme is literally 3 notes held down on a synthesizer. The arpeggiator is doing all the work there. They are not playing those notes individually. Yeah, anyway, here's that synth marimba part. And the last marimba part here is an underscore to the actual melody. It's the exact same notes as the melody, but it's doing those like classic marimba trills things throughout it. Again, kind of adding this like fun Crash Bandicoot vibe to the mix. And here's the thing, a lot of these marimbas you can't really hear with a lot of detail in the final mix, but they just add that extra layer of like oingo boingo quirk to the track, which is really important. But there's just like so much going on in the track that you really have to listen for it. But speaking of the melody, that of course is being handled by more electric guitar, split between the octave to give it kind of a beefier sound. Which not only matches the Oingo Boingo vibe like perfectly, but also keeps the track kind of in line with the other Theorist theme songs like Game Theory and GT Live, because they're all kind of guitar-driven songs. I know that was something Matt really liked. However, that wasn't how I originally wrote it. I think the melody to this song is honestly kind of weird for a guitar, and the reason is that it was originally written with a MIDI saxophone. And it was originally a lot smoother, jazzier, kind of free-flowing, where the guitar was kind of like stiff and angular by comparison. You know, check it out. We loved how that sounded, but weirdly enough, we kind of all agreed that it somehow took away the food vibe of the song. I don't know how, but it did. It honestly made the track sound more like Persona music than anything. Which is great, but it just didn't really fit the vibe. So we did a pass with guitar instead of the saxophone and agreed that it just worked better. But on that note, the only other thing going on in this verse section here are the horns. They aren't doing a ton here, but the stings that they add throughout the verse add a whole lot of energy and excitement to the track. Again, I studied that Oingo Boingo live footage and saw that their horn section was primarily made up of a trumpet, a trombone, and like 2 saxophone players. So that's exactly what I did. This horn section is made up of a trumpet, another trumpet kind of doing the same thing but an octave below, an alto saxophone, a baritone saxophone, so a lower pitch saxophone that's harmonizing, and then this kind of like aggressive, spitty trombone. I really like the growl that it adds to the mix. Altogether, it sounds like this. And with that final blast of the horns, we hit this kind of swift turn into a heavier rock thing as the lead guitar finishes up the melody and just sort of falls away. The rhythm guitars get way more distorted, way louder, and start just blasting out these big power chords. Which is followed closely by the marimba, and the bass, all just kind of coming together to make these two chords sound as big as possible, which is made even more like exciting and adrenaline pumping by the drums going just like full hair metal. And a whole new element to the track, a pure old school 80s synth. My alarm. Yeah, I am a sucker for this kind of sound, dude. Specifically, this is an old 80s synth meant to replicate a brass section, so even more horns. And again, it's just hitting those same two chords as the guitars and bass. But then I added this like pitch vibrato thing to the synths that give it a whole new sense of movement. If you don't know what vibrato is, it's this very subtle movement of a note up and down. It sort of occurs like naturally in a human voice when someone is singing, so adding it to an instrument can really add this level of like expression to a performance, a much more natural feel. And what's cooler is when you add it to a synth like this, it gives it that Ghostbusters vibe, which I love. Fun fact, all you have to do to add that is just take this little dongle, push it up. The synth setting just starts wobbling. And of course, all of this is building and building and building to the end of the song, where we go all the way to how the song began with a fast-paced prog rock riff split between a bunch of different instruments. It's not the same riff as the beginning. This one is shorter, and I can actually reliably play it on guitar and bass. But with the tension of the track kind of like ramping up like this, I thought it only made sense to go back to the original motif of the song to kind of give things an explosive finale. You know, bringing back that like prog rock riff idea really brings the song full circle. For the first time since the intro, the organ comes back, coupled of course with the marimba, and a live bass this time, no cheating here. But to make things even bigger, we've got the guitars jumping into the fray now. Other instruments like the drums and the synths just kind of drop out here to let the riff do its thing, but they do pop back in for that final note, so the whole track ends with a real punch. But my favorite part here is by far what the horns are doing. Instead of playing in unison with that final riff, they all kind of hold on this one chord that hits really quickly before getting super quiet and then building and building and building in volume until we hit that last stab at the end. So this whole finale just sort of careens into the final note. And that's the Food Theory theme. Yeah, well, technically this is a little bit more of the Food Theory theme than you might be used to hearing. Yeah, what I just talked about is exactly how I wrote the theme, but the versions you've probably heard in the actual show do cut out like maybe a couple of seconds. Does it matter? No. Did I still feel the need to point it out because every single minute of music that I write is incredibly precious to me? Yeah. Also, it would be a crime not to mention the amazing visuals that went along with this theme. The team over at Theorists did an incredible job matching the vibe of the music visually. And like I said, this is just one of my favorite things I've ever written. The genre was right in my wheelhouse. Matt and Team Theorist really trusted me to take this song where it needed to go, while also giving a lot of great suggestions on how to make the song the best it could be. My only real gripe with this song after all these years is it is the production. Yeah, I was still kind of in my early stages of learning like proper production and mixing techniques, and it's like pretty obvious to me now. Like there's some instrumental spots here that don't even have any EQ on them, which is basically a way to cut or boost different frequencies in a recording. You know, make it more tinny, make it more bassy, things like that. Theoretically, you should be EQing everything in a track, but there are some pieces here that just don't have any of that. The lead guitar doesn't have any of that. It's a pretty messy slapdash project on a technical level that pretty much any more experienced producer or engineer would just get sick looking at. And actually, what you heard in this video is actually kind of a slightly updated remastering, because when I performed this song live for Matt and Steph's charity live stream for St. Jude back in 2021, I kind of needed like a karaoke track to play through. I don't have a band. And I kind of touched up a few pieces of the production while I was at it. But either way, I am incredibly proud of this track. Again, one of my favorite things I've ever written. And I've been super grateful to see just how positively the Theorist audience has responded to this track over the years. And of course, if you're a fan of the videos over on Food Theory and haven't seen it yet, last week the channel launched its very first video hosted exclusively by creative director and new full-time head of the show, Santi. I think they did an amazing job, so if you haven't seen it already, you should go over there and support the new hosts. Or I guess if you want more of my music content, there is literally one other video that you could watch. It's the one I did a little over a week ago about the Game Theory Symphony that I did for MatPat's final Game Theory episode. And I guess if you want more videos like this, yeah, maybe I could do the next one on my GT Live theme. I don't know. So yeah. Leave.